Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We had this live gender cafe 2 days ago, and there was a recording mishap. So I'm re-recording here for you to watch at a later time. So again, thanks for being here. We're here to talk about LGBTQI plus inclusion and our work. And I'm here on behalf of the Society of Gender Professionals. So I do want to quickly introduce Society of Gender Professionals, also SGP, for those of you who are not already familiar with us. So SGP is an international association of gender practitioners and academics and activists, and we're dedicated to promoting feminist action and applied research and raising the profile of gender expertise around the world. So on the screen, you can see our mission, and this includes supporting member collaboration, network building, mentoring, and leadership, and also advancing gender equity. We do have over 200 current members and over 30,000 in our networks between our newsletter and social media, especially LinkedIn. And you can find more about us at this link on the screen, which is genderprofessionals.org/membership. So hi, I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Bren Nyayira Kuch. I use they, them pronouns. I was in higher education for 17 years and then spent a bit of time with Mercy Corps, with USAID. Now I'm at the Center for International Environmental Law, doing human resources and diversity, equity, and inclusion work. This is what I love to do. I'm also the current co-president and previous treasurer for SGP, which is why I'm here on behalf of them. Personally, I am queer. Happy Pride, by the way. I identify as agender, also non-binary. I'll talk more about these terms later if you do not know what that means. I have a white, European ethnic background. I'm an Oregonian. I'm from Oregon and I love it. It's where this picture was taken. I'm neurodivergent and I am a big nerd. And one of the things I'm a big nerd for is gender, which you are going to find out here today. So our goals for today are just to learn more about LGBTQIA2S+ identities, particularly gender, and disambiguate some terms. A lot of the times these terms are sort of combined together and people don't necessarily know the difference. So I'm going to talk a lot about the terms and help to disambiguate those. And then we're also going to reflect on being more inclusive of these identities in our personal lives and in our work. So thank you for being here with me today, and I hope we can achieve these goals. So I always ask this question when I do this presentation, and so I will ask you, everyone who's watching this, if you have thought about why you identify as the gender that you do. So I'm actually going to pause for a sec and ask that you think about this. And the reason I ask this is not a lot of people have thought about their gender. It's sort of a given, right? We are assigned a gender at birth based on our genitals, and we say, okay, well, that's what I am. And we don't necessarily take the time to think about it. So usually when I ask this question, it's about 50-50. Half the people say they have not thought about it, half said that they do. So if you have not thought about why you identify with your gender, definitely encourage you to do that. When I did this, I actually started asking a bunch of my friends why they identified with their gender, and it was fascinating to hear their responses and to start these dialogues around gender with people who I was close to. So I also encourage that, especially people who are not trans, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So this acronym is very big. There's a lot of different letters in it. It's often said differently with different letters. And the acronym combines gender and sex and sexuality. And again, these are often conflated. So like I said, first I'm going to talk about terminology. Also, because this acronym is so unwieldy and it changes often, a lot of times people will say gender and sexual minorities, or they'll say SOGIESC, which is SOGIESC, and that stands for sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. And we'll get into all of those a little later in the presentation. So first off, I want to talk about the difference between sex and gender. So sex on the right here is the biological construction of our body and includes things like sex organs and chromosomes, lots more. Sex is often assigned at birth based on genitalia, like I previously mentioned, and usually assigned only as male or female. And then we'll get into how sex is not binary more a little later. On the other hand, gender is your internal sense of identity, So if someone asks you what gender you are, many of you would be able to immediately answer because you feel it internally, no matter what gender or sex you had been assigned when you were born. However, gender is a concept that is defined by social and cultural norms. It includes things like gender roles, behavior, gender expressions, lots more. Some people even talk about feminine or masculine energy, right? Which is the vibe that someone gives off like she has such feminine energy. But of course, that aligns with whatever the social definition of feminine is at that time. So part of the gender puzzle is that this definition changes across time and space. So as a basic example, nowadays in the United States, where I'm from, we think of pink as feminine, and it's often marketed that way, right? But until about 100 years ago, blue was a delicate feminine color, and pink was this strong masculine color. So a young girl wearing pink would have actually been considered maybe masculine or maybe gender nonconforming. Meg John Barker is a really great gender researcher in the United Kingdom, and they talk about how gender is biopsychosocial. So that means it's our neurons, our hormones, our psychological makeup, the societal influences that we grew up with, and a lot more that form this really big, messy concept that we call gender. And some of that does include attributes from the sex column. So sex and gender are not a binary either. No, down with binaries. Also, please note, this is a really Western way of looking at sex and gender. So various cultures have different ways of looking at sexuality and gender and sex. And even in the Western context, this is a relatively new way of looking at these. Gender and sex are still used interchangeably a lot. Think about forms, for example. So yeah, just a grain of salt to take with all of this. So some gender terms. So cisgender, as I think I mentioned before, also referred to as cis, refers to people who identify with the sex or gender that they were assigned at birth. So for example, a cis woman is someone who was assigned a girl at birth who internally identifies as a girl or a woman. Transgender or trans people do not identify with the sex or gender they were assigned at birth. So a trans woman would be a baby, for example, assigned a boy at birth who internally identifies as a girl or a woman. In both of these examples, we have two women, and they both identify as a woman based on what their own perception of woman is, which of course is going to differ between people. I encourage you, again, to ask women why they identify as a woman, ask men why they identify as a man, and you'll get a lot of different responses, right? Because we all have different definitions of what those things mean. Non-binary people do not experience their gender as strictly male or female, so their gender exists outside of these two buckets, such as somewhere else along the spectrum here, or even outside of the spectrum, or maybe for gender fluid people, maybe bouncing around on the spectrum. Some non-binary people consider themselves trans since they do not identify with the sex assigned to them at birth, but some do not. So whether or not a non-binary person identifies as transgender is completely up to them, and it really depends on the person. Also of note, gender-affirming surgery or medical interventions like hormones are never required for anyone to be legitimately trans or non-binary, and it's not polite to ask people, especially strangers, about their bodies, about their hormones or surgeries, right? We don't ask cis people that. Again, sex and gender, these are separate things. Different people have different opinions on their bodies, just like cis people, and how they want their bodies to look and feel. So historically, trans people have had to pass as the opposite gender, but it doesn't really necessarily reflect how they actually wanted their bodies to be, right? Maybe a trans woman had to look extremely feminine, wear lots of pink, right? Have long hair, have breasts, all these things, but maybe she didn't actually want to do that, right? Maybe she didn't want breasts. Maybe she wants to keep short hair. So it's really, it was, a lot of it was sort of forced by the times, right? So there's also a reason we use the term transgender now, because it's about gender, it's not about sex. And in a lot of places, including the US, we no longer use the word transsexual, or at least a lot of people don't. First off, because gender is not about sex, so we use gender, right, instead of transsexual, but also because the term has been deemed derogatory by a lot of people in the trans community, so we need to respect that and just not use that word. So general ally tip, try to always have an updated understanding of the acceptable terms to use for any marginalized group in your community, in your work. Just, listen to that community and try to you keep up with it and use that language. So the phrase non-binary is often used as a blanket term to describe all gender identities that fall outside of strictly man or woman. And so, as you can see in this image, there's a lot of genders under the non-binary umbrella, including agender, gender fluid, gender queer. This also includes gender minorities around the world, which I'll get into in a second. I also want to acknowledge non-binary is imperfect. It's overly generic. It's US centric. It's definitely an English word. So, there's not sort of one perfect answer, but this term is becoming more common now. You're probably seeing it in the news more than, maybe 5-10 years ago. So it is a common word. So the current Western definitions of gender and sexuality are relatively modern, and they're not actually reflective of the world's diverse culture and history. So many gender minorities played central roles in their culture, but colonizers decided that diversity in gender and sexuality was this thing considered barbaric or ungodly, and they attempted to eliminate them through, the tactics of colonization. So we have forced assimilation, creating or changing laws to make certain acts illegal, or just simply murdering them. Sometimes in the US, there's a thought that trans and non-binary genders are this newfangled thing that American kids these days are doing, but these are not new, and they're definitely not Western, which you can see, as you can see on this map, which is hyperlinked in the presentation. Gender diversity has existed all over the world for thousands of years. These are just a couple of examples. There's lots more that have existed out there and still do exist. Unfortunately, as you'll see, some of these places are not particularly queer friendly or trans friendly, right? Because some of these places have taken on the stigmas of their oppressors. So we have cultures that were once open to diversity in gender and sexuality, who today may be more heteronormative and more cisnormative because of those intentional efforts of colonization to eliminate that diversity. However, I really want to stress, in a lot of cases, these people still exist. They are still living and trying to survive in this world that is extremely oppressive for them. Also, how sex and gender are treated differs across cultures. So Western societies, like I mentioned, we may assign sex and gender at birth based on genitals. This is not always the case. So for example, the Igbo of Nigeria appear to assign gender around age 5, and the Mbuti of Central Africa do not assign a specific gender to a child until after puberty, which I think is pretty cool. So gender, again, in this binary Western concept, is represented here by boy or girl. This binary also applies to sexuality, right? There's straight or gay, or gender expression. You have masculine or feminine. Very simplistic, right? But we're slowly moving away from the binary, and these terms are now sometimes defined on spectrums. So this one represents, there's identities that fall between boy and girl, which is good. There's progress in the spectrum. But the Trevor Project has gone further in looking at them in more than one dimension. So this beautiful amoeba model, as I like to call it, because I have biology background, represents that things are more complicated than a spectrum. It also shows that boy and girl aren't necessarily just two opposites of one another. So in this model, we have, the classic boy or man and girl or woman, but we also have non-binary, there's agender, there's a whole lot of places in between. So I encourage everyone to think of this amoeba model when you see any spectrum or any binary, to sort of think of things in a different way, think of things outside of that binary. The Trevor Project uses this lovely amoeba model to describe gender identity, like we just saw, but also gender expression and sexuality, which I'll quickly review and do some of that disambiguation. So for gender expression, we have classic binary terms like masculine and feminine, but we also have androgynous and there's genderless. So someone, if you sort of mix these two amoebas together and take attributes from each one, someone could be a feminine man, they can be a masculine non-binary person. There's, of course, hundreds of combinations here. depending on, where you are on each of the amoebas, what color you are, to say. Gender identity and gender expression don't have to be correlated, right? Just because you're a girl or a woman doesn't mean you have to be feminine. So in a separate amoeba on the right is sexuality. So of course you can be attracted to men, to women, to non-binary people, because yes, that is a thing. You cannot have any sexual attraction at all, which is what we call asexual. Again, there's lots of different options here. This is also not tied to gender identity or gender expression, but they are often conflated. So as an example, when I was growing up, which was in the 80s and 90s, boys were assumed to be masculine and attracted to women, and the opposite was true for girls. So if you deviated from any of these sort of formulas, you were simply considered gay, right? And gay was a big derogatory term in the 90s in the US and maybe other places. But these things are not necessarily related. So while my childhood peers from small town Oregon may not agree, it is possible to be a woman who is androgynous and attracted to men and non-binary people, right? Again, you can mix all of these different attributes from these different bubbles. Those are completely valid ways to be. Another example, drag queens can enjoy performing femininity, but they can still be straight or they can still be cisgender men. It doesn't, just because they are performing femininity doesn't mean they're a trans woman. It doesn't mean they're queer. It just depends on the person. This also means you can't tell someone's gender or sexuality by looking at them, especially since there's a lot of people out there who remain hidden for safety reasons. So gaydar, as we used to call it, is not actually a thing. All it does is really see if somebody is transgressing the roles for their, perceived gender based on how that person looks in that particular society. So next time you see someone conflating gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, now you can think back to these amoebas and maybe have a conversation and disambiguate those terms for them as well. I'd also like to caveat, there are cultures across the world that do have an interdependency between gender and sexuality. So there's not like a right answer. There's no one way to think about these things. And again, the separation is fairly Western, fairly US centric. So it might be different where you live. So heteronormativity, kind of an academic word. This is, if you look at the word heterosexual, and normative, normal, this assumes that people are by default straight. Cisnormativity assumes the same thing about being cisgender, that this is the normal way to be in the world. It also assumes that if you aren't these things, if you aren't straight or cisgender, then there's something wrong with you or there's something different about you, as opposed to it just being part of, the variety of the human experience. There are many queer and trans people out there who are assumed to be straight and cis, usually by the way that they, it can be the way that they present, right? Like a non-binary person who looks feminine might be gendered as a woman. It can be based on the gender of their partner, right? So a bisexual man who's dating a cis woman might be assumed to be straight just because he's dating a cis woman. So heteronormativity, cisnormativity erase their identities, and it means they can feel invisible. It means maybe they have to come out over and over again to be recognized. Like, I told you, I'm bi. Just because I'm dating a woman doesn't mean I don't have that identity anymore. This can happen to an individual, right? Like assuming an individual's gender or sexuality, but it also happens systemically. So, binary gender bathrooms sort of assume non-binary people don't exist, or at least that we don't have to use the bathroom. The medical system sort of assumes everyone is cisgender and they don't incorporate trans-affirming care. They just assume everyone's cis. So cisnormativity, heteronormativity, they're not just annoying, but they're very harmful on this systemic societal level. So we talked about gender and sexuality, which are these internal identities, but now I want to talk about sex a little bit, which is based on biology. So intersex characteristics are those that do not fit medical or social norms for female or male bodies. There are over 40 varieties of intersex traits. There's lots of them. A couple common ones are androgen insensitivity, where somebody has androgens like testosterone in their body just doesn't recognize them. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia, there's micropenis, there's various combinations of chromosomes like an XXY, for example, and lots of others, like I said. So because these bodies are different, People with intersex traits experience a lot of stigmatization. There's discrimination. There's a lot of harmful practices. One of those is non-consensual medical interventions, like genital surgery on babies, to make their bodies more typically female or male. So if a baby is born with atypical genitalia, the doctor will often sort of pick a gender and perform surgery on this baby. Maybe they never get told growing up that this happened, and they, start having some gender feelings later on, and it's, they learn that this decision was made for them. So non-consensual and bodily autonomy are really big issues here. So while we have socially defined norms for what genitalia constitutes male and female, sex is more complicated than that. It's not just genitals. So for example, there's some people assigned female at birth who naturally have more testosterone or naturally have more body hair than someone else assigned male at birth, right? I like the saying that there's more variation within groups, right? There's more variation within women or within men than there are between groups. There also isn't consensus around what belongs in the sort of box of intersex. So the Intersex Society of North America has some examples. How small does a penis have to be before it counts as intersex? Do you count sex chromosome variations if there's no external sexual ambiguity? I like this graph. It's also, this article is linked in the presentation. It shows that sex and gender are not binary, but they're bimodal. And this shows it's more of a distribution and less of a, like, you have to be an X or Y. Another problem with understanding intersex variations is that they are common, but they're not always known. They're not documented necessarily. Right? How many of us here have had chromosome or hormone tests? Not a whole lot, unless we perceive there's something wrong. And then that's when it becomes standard to do those tests. So this makes the estimation difficult. One common statistic is that nearly 2% of people are born with intersex variations. Maybe that's an understatement too. We don't necessarily know, but that's a common one. That 2% is as common as A negative blood type, as red hair, as green eyes, or the entire population of Russia or Japan compared to the global population. But who do we hear about more? Russians or intersex people? Are people with A negative blood forcibly operated on to give them a more common blood type? That sounds completely ridiculous, but this is exactly what happens with intersex babies. So the stereotypes that go along with this sex binarism, there has to be male or female sex, these are really harmful to people who live outside of those binaries. So despite what we're taught in high school biology class, sex is not binary, right? And since sex isn't just genitals, some folks find out about being intersex at various stages in their life. So it can be as babies, like we've talked about. It can be during puberty when hormones start activating and lots of stuff starts happening in the body. Maybe it can be when they're trying to conceive and they can't get pregnant. And so they end up going to the doctor and getting all these tests done. Or probably for a lot of us, never. Sex is a spectrum. There's so many variables. It's not just these two different shapes of Legos and you're either one or the other. And since intersex, by the way, is not a gender, intersex people can identify their genders however they choose, just like endosex people, which is non-intersex. They can identify as a man, as a woman, as non-binary, etc. Some might consider themselves transgender, some might not. Again, it depends on the person. So just listen to what they have to say about themselves and use that language respectfully. So pronouns, probably heard a lot about pronouns lately, at least in the US, people are having these conversations more. These are how you talk about someone. So she went to the store with her friend. She, her in this example, and he, him are standard English pronouns, which are binary. We have non-binary examples. They include they, them, which is what I use. This means they went to the store with their friend. There's also lots of neopronouns. So as you can see, Z, Zir is one on this little chart here. Z went to the store with Zir friend. Some people don't use pronouns at all. So it would be Bren went to the store with Bren's friend. The image here also points out that MX, pronounced mix, is the gender neutral version of Ms. or Mr., which is becoming more common on forms in the US, and a lot of different people use this. So sure, I use this as a non-binary person, trans people might use this, cis people even use this. And I like to correlate this back to the introduction of the term Ms. in the 1970s, didn't exist before the 70s. It was created because women didn't want to be associated with whether or not they were married, right? You have Miss or Mrs. at the time, and women said, hey, it doesn't matter if I'm married, you don't need to know that about me. So they invented Ms. So now, hey, you don't need to know my gender in order to respect me. So a lot of people are using MX. So they, as in they, them, this is generally considered neutral if you aren't sure about someone's pronouns. So this happens a lot, right? I remember a couple of years ago, the whistleblower submitted their report last week. Nobody knew the gender of the whistleblower. Someone forgot their bag. Oh no, I hope they come back for it. You don't know the gender of the person who forgot their bag. This has been used in English as gender neutral singular since the 1300s. There's a lot of grammar nerds out there. I used to be one of them. I can relate, who say, no, this isn't grammatically correct. It's been used. It was actually a lot more common before Victorian sort of language and colonization happened in a lot of places. Also, a lot of people find it very easy to use they when they don't know who the person is, or it's maybe like a hypothetical person, right? Like, oh, when we hire someone, they're going to go through this onboarding program. It's not really a specific person. So it's very easy. And if you start listening for it, you'll hear this a lot. But these same people will find it really hard when someone explicitly asks for they, them pronouns to be used, which is kind of funny and unfortunate. So I ask you all, please practice. I know we have decades of conditioning. It's really hard to change, but we can. We just need to practice and give it some time. So another complicating factor is that someone's pronouns don't necessarily tell you what their gender identity is, right? Like I know non-binary people who use he, him, or she, her pronouns. Not everyone who uses they, them is non-binary. Not every non-binary person uses, neopronouns. So that can be a little confusing. Just like with gender identity, you can't tell someone's pronouns by looking at them either. So just believe people, use the pronouns that they ask you to use. It's not an invitation to like argue with them about using them. Trans-binary and non-binary people are at a much higher risk of mental health issues and suicidal ideation related to lack of support for their gender, right? It's because of that oppression that we have greater mental health issues. And so using the correct pronouns can show somebody respect. It's a simple way to literally save lives sometimes, especially for trans youth who have a much higher rate of suicidal ideation than non-trans youth. If you do make a mistake, which happens, I still make mistakes, it's okay. Correct yourself and move on, and then practice later and really try to get it right. If you aren't sure what someone's pronouns are, you can introduce yours and they might do the same, right? Hi, I'm Bren. I use they, them pronouns. Oh, hi, I'm Anne. I use she, her pronouns. You can also just ask respectfully. So most people, especially queer and trans people, would rather you ask and get it right. And then you can check with that person if they're, if they're out, if they're open, if they're okay, if you correct other people, so you can be an ally, right? If you hear other people using the wrong pronouns. So just generally always ask respectfully, and check someone's email signature, their social media, their website. If you aren't sure, often this information is in, for example, email signatures. I remember reading a story one time about someone who worked at an organization and they had they, them pronouns in their email signature, but nobody checked. And so everybody misgendered them. So if there are ways to check, definitely recommend that you do that first. So English is incorporating more gender neutral options, but this can be harder with some other languages. So language is really important and it adds a lot of complication to everything. So depending on where you were raised, depending on the languages that you speak, you will likely think about gender or even everyday words differently. Some languages do not have gendered pronouns, like the English he and she. Some have many more than two. So this image on the bottom right here is an example of some neutral pronouns in various languages. And this is just an example. This is an old image. There are many more being created or that exist. So grammatical gender is the system many of you might be familiar with that assigns gender to nouns, and it exists in a lot of languages, not in English, but for example, French, Spanish, the Latin languages. The genders also don't always align across languages. So for example, the moon in Spanish and Italian is la luna, which is feminine. But in German, it's der Mond, which is masculine. I like to think the moon is gender fluid, but who knows what the Spanish, Italians, and Germans might have to say about that. I also learned while doing this presentation a couple years ago, an Italian woman told me that the noun for table in Italian is tavola, and it's feminine. And Italians describe tables as being communal spaces centered around family. So they use these traditionally like feminine terms to describe tables. But in German, table is masculine, and Germans describe tables with masculine terms such as strength. So I thought this was really fascinating. And again, how, the language that we grew up speaking can really change how we think about gender, but also everyday items because of this grammatical gender. In many languages, the default person or animal is binary male, right? We have mankind. You see a cute animal and you think, oh, he's so, look at him, he's so cute, whatever it is, right? You don't know the animal's gender or sex. Like, it's just sort of a default that I catch myself doing even now, right? I still do it. So feminists will tell you when a person, back to people, is defined as a man, it doesn't turn out so great for people who aren't men. Unfortunately, man is hard-coded into a lot of laws, into a lot of language specifically. In some languages, you can have a group of 99 women and you add one man and the gender of the group turns to be binary male, right? Like from Latinas to Latino, because one man joined that group. So we are, there's more gender neutral language like Latine that people use then to refer to groups that are mixed gender so that it's not just by default male. When it comes to addressing others politely, the way we address people like ladies and gentlemen is binary, of course. Some people will say guys, gals, and non-binary pals, which I like. But you can also use friends or colleagues or everyone or just all. I say hey all a lot, or y'all if you're in the US. And there's a lot of different solutions that are gender neutral here. When you say excuse me to a person on the street, you would likely say excuse me, ma'am, or a senora, or mademoiselle, whatever the language is, which puts the speaker in charge of assuming someone's gender, and this leads to misgendering, particularly for non-binary and for transgender people. So I think we can just get used to saying excuse me without adding that gendered honorific. Excuse me, you forgot your bag. When you sneeze, you say excuse me, you don't say excuse me, ma'am. So I know a lot of people, however, were raised to say sir and ma'am, that was a form of politeness. And so this is contentious, right? There's not really a gender neutral honorific that is common to use. So language with all of its rules and variations is very complicated. There's not a right answer here, but progress and inclusion come from pushing tradition, and they come from having these conversations and asking these questions. Then also having the words available to describe or even recognize ourselves is essential. There's something called hermeneutical injustice, and that means you don't have, we didn't have the words to describe how we felt. Non-binary didn't exist, 50 years ago. So people couldn't identify that way because we didn't know that was a thing, right? But now there's, an increase of out trans and non-binary people, at least in the US for the past few years, simply because people are like, oh, that's an option. There's a word for how I feel. That's exactly how I felt. And it's just so great to see that in some languages anyways, there's more language available, more words available to address how we actually feel. Language is also important for how marginalized groups are spoken about and treated socially. So for example, the word queer, right, was derogatory for a really long time, but now some people have reclaimed it within the LGBTQI plus community. I could talk about language for 1,000 years, but I do want to move on to inclusivity and allyship in our work, and then also in our personal lives. So in our work, what anyone can do, and what we need allies to do is to advocate for change when you see a lack of inclusivity. So when you see that binary data, when you look at data collection and there's no option for, when there's only male and female options, when you see policies, speak up. When you do research, when you conduct research, look for research that's been done by queer and trans people. You have the power to do this in your references, right? You can learn from others who have done this before. There's a lot of progress that's been made recently with different organizations, different individuals. So see what's out there. We ask, you can collaborate with others. This can be joining a LGBTQI plus employee resource group, researching how to make your projects more inclusive or your lessons for those of you who are in the teaching field. Recognize your assumptions and call yourself out. This can be really uncomfortable, but if you do make a mistake on someone's pronouns, for example, correct yourself and move on, right? Like be a good example for others and they can follow suit, especially if you're in a leadership position. It's really important that leaders do this because even if we want to pretend, oh, we're not hierarchical, it's still how the leader acts around these things is really important for the organization. And then practice makes better, doesn't make perfect. There's no such thing, but do the work to use people's right names, their right pronouns. Practice, you can talk about, that person to a friend. Oh, yesterday I was working on a project with Joe and they said they had a great idea, whatever it is, right? Like practice. Think about, in feminist spaces, what does queering feminism look like? What does queering your spaces look like? And this is maybe more of a academic thought or exercise, but can be really helpful. Normalize pronouns, putting your pronouns in your email signature, normalize all these best practices and also share why they're important, because that is important as well, right? Why sharing pronouns is important is because it normalizes its use. It means not only queer and trans people are sharing, right? Like there's a lot of best practices there that you can help as an ally. Seek queer and trans and non-binary board members and presenters and panelists, and not just people who talk or write or speak about gender issues, right? Like there's plenty of trans people who are technical experts, who are experts in the migration patterns of birds or whatever it is, right? Like it doesn't just have to be about gender. You don't just have to hire marginalized people to talk about their oppression. So do the work to find that. Do some research and call attention. I love calling attention to how the gender binary is a colonial construct. People think it's just normal and natural, but it's not. It was created, it was enforced intentionally. It also intersects with racism, with anti-fatness, with heterosexism, with misogyny, right? Like, so there's all of these intersections that that happen together, and the more that we can learn and understand and share about those, the better we will be. Actively include all genders using inclusive terminology. Again, instead of ladies and gentlemen, hey everyone, for example. And then know who to ask or where to look. There's a lot of information online about all of this. I'm available. I always love answering questions. Know who to ask. Don't just find a random person who looks trans to you and ask them for advice about these things. So then, of course, this advocacy isn't just a hat we take on and off when we go to work, right, and go home, just like other forms of equality. So advocating for racial and disability and queer and gender justice, these all need to be part of our work, but also our daily lives. And those can inform one another, absolutely. So seek out and center the experiences and opinions of diverse LGBTQI plus people, not just cis white gay men. There are, fat, disabled people of color out there who have an entirely different experience that we should all be listening to. Diversify your media. So your entertainment, your social media, your journalism, your TV, like watch shows and read stories that have this representation to help normalize it. I'm just watching Sort of right now, which is a great show about a non-binary Pakistani person and the things happening in their life. So I recommend that. It's on HBO Max. Like I said before, don't assume someone's gender or their sex or their sexuality based on how they look or act. Again, intersex people are 2% of the population. That's 2 in 100 in a room. many of us are in rooms with thousands of people, right? Or we work with hundreds of people. We shouldn't be assuming their sex, that everybody is endosex, right? Like the same with gender and sexuality. Just don't make these assumptions. Respect people's pronouns, as we talked about before, and proactively share yours. Speak inclusively, even if you don't see any queer or trans people in the room. We're there. Sometimes we're not out yet. Sometimes we haven't even realized it ourselves, but the way that people speak about queerness and transness around us really impacts like how safe you are, how much of an ally you are. So don't just be an ally when you think we're standing there watching you, right? I sort of mentioned this before. Do your own research online before asking someone to explain a concept. Especially, walking up to a trans person and saying, "Hi, can you explain gender to me?" Like there's so many resources online created by queer and trans people. That's important. That, we can learn a lot that way. And then even if you don't understand them, just believe people, respect their identities. It's so hard to have to argue for our own right to exist. So please just believe us and ask what you can do to support us or how you can respect us. So there's some resources here. I'll super quickly go through them. If I can open them in my screen share. So the Global Center has an Inclusion at Work series that consists of, creating LGBT inclusion at work, sexual orientation, gender identity, right? There's all these managing LGBTI plus employees. So these are just different little PDFs composed of terms and key concepts. So you can always look at those through the Global Center. Global Center also, I've worked on these things, which is why I'm sharing them with you, has so the COVID cocoon, this is what employers should know about gender transition and return to work. So this is how to be supportive of particularly trans people, since a lot of people transitioned during the pandemic. Fascinating. I did some research. I talked to people who transitioned during the pandemic and wrote this report. So it's really focused on leadership and human resources. It's free, so you can just go read it. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions and want to talk about it. It's long, but there's an executive summary, so don't worry. Gender inclusive language resources or alternatives. We have 25 languages here to learn more about gender inclusion in languages other than English. Well, we have English as well, but Arabic, German, Ladino, I don't even know what that is, but it's on here. Russian, Tagalog, there's some resources in English about the Tagalog language. So check this out. It's open for anyone to make a comment. So if you have a language or a resource to add, would love for you to add that. Thank you very much in advance. Then we have some information, the F&M Global Barometers and ILGA's maps of sexual orientation laws, just to give you, and they have lots of languages too, to give you an overview of what the laws are around, this is particularly sexual orientation around the world, what marriage is legal, lots of, I can't scroll, and they have this sort of visual map to see the dangerous places and the positive places. F&M Global Barometers are similar, but they have let's see, F&M Global Barometer of Transgender Rights. You can see there's a lot of red in the world. Thank you, Latin America, for being slightly better. And you can click on a given country and learn more about what it's like to be queer, trans in Bolivia. Then lastly, here's that map of gender diverse cultures. You can click, where did it go? Oh, here we go. You can click and learn more about the cultures in that area. So Bakla in the Philippines is here. We have things I can't pronounce. I think there's travesti in South America. So you can learn a little bit more about these cultures. Again, this isn't all of them, but there sure are a lot, and it's really interesting. And I love whoever made this map. So those are my resources. If you have the slides, which we always share in conjunction with the recording, then you can go back, click, go through and look at the resources that I had referenced throughout the presentation. So that's it. And I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned from this, and you can always email me It's brenna.cooch@gmail.com if you have questions. I love talking about gender. So thanks a lot for joining me today, and I wish you a happy Pride and a happy being inclusive. Thanks so much.